My name is Bill Durham. I'm Bing Professor in Human Biology and Anthropology at Stanford University.
Well, we're really happy you're joining us, especially to talk about a very important concept. Now, we've just been learning about lactose intolerance and about the idea that as all infants, we have the ability as mammals to digest these lactose-containing products. And as we get older, our lactase expression diminishes. But in some people, the lactase gene sort of stays on and we continue to make lactase. And so I guess we'll start off by asking, why in human evolution would something like this happen? How could something like this even happen?
Well, from a pan-mammalian background where the lactase activity peaks around birth and then tails off quickly into the weaning period and into adulthood, we know that that's pan-mammalian. Even your house cat is lactose malabsorber or lactose intolerant. At least every house cat that's been tested is, even though people will give milk to their house cats. And what we don't know is whether the people have found the threshold or the cats found the threshold to avoid diarrhea and other consequences. What's interesting then is from that background of a peak, some human populations show persistent lactase activity into adulthood, while the majority continue to decline. So it's that minority of lactose tolerant adults that are really fascinating. It's a wonderful question because here's a case where you have an intraspecific polymorphism. You have the existence and the ongoing persistence of a genetic difference between human populations with regard to some relatively simple trait, and a trait that has to be relatively recent in human history.
Sure.
There were no sources of milk prior to dairy animals. So what we have here is, other than mother's milk, there were no mammalian sources of milk for human populations before agriculture. And so here we have...
Right, and I was going to wonder too, the idea that, are we the only species that actually drinks the milk from another species as well?
I'm not aware of any species that makes a habit of drinking the milk of another species. I'm aware of infants of an infant of a particular mother nursing from another mother. That happens in pinnipeds. It happens in several mammals. Okay. It's considered milk stealing, and obviously there's great reward to the successful pup, but I'm not aware of another case where, especially where infants or adults drink milk from another mammal. That's a good question. I just don't know an answer to that.
So we have this scenario then, as you mentioned, where we have this sort of minority of people who, instead of having lactase expression diminish over time, it's
persistent lactase activity into adulthood.
Sure. Now, you mentioned that it seems to be relevant specifically because of the recent evolution of this trait, because the domestication of dairy.
So we assume that the pan-mammalian background means that at the dawn of history, human populations were all lactose intolerant, and that there would be, at best, a mutationally low frequency of individuals that varied on that characteristic. And because it was a very low variation and there was no milk available, we would have no way of knowing how much there was or how often it recurred and so on. But what we have then in the meantime is this great invention called agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals at the service of the human food supply. We have every reason to believe that the main animals that are used for milk today were originally domesticated for meat. They were valued first for meat. And that milk was, as the expression goes, that we're part of a secondary products revolution where they realized that you could use more than the meat from these animals, goats, sheep, cattle, and so on. And so they already probably had them in close association with human communities. They were probably already harvesting the meat regularly. They probably had mastered overwintering, water supply, herding activities, and that sort of thing. And then suddenly there's evidence for using the milk product of these animals. Some of the earliest evidence comes from Sahara rock paintings that are dated to 4500 BP that show, in fact, bringing the calf up near the female, the adult female, and a human being underneath. Now, we infer that the human being underneath is doing this. What else is a human being doing under a cow? But that's some of the earliest evidence. And what's interesting is that they bring the calf up to trigger the letdown reflex in the cow so that the humans can take the milk. And to this day, farmers will tell you there's lots of ways to induce that reflex, but one of them is bringing the calf up.
That makes so much sense. It's
Doesn't
like
it?
a
Yeah.
woman hearing a baby cry in a department store and
Absolutely.
she starts
Yeah,
lactating.
Yeah, absolutely. Same thing. And so it's clear then, or we surmise from this history, that milk was valued, or that cattle were valued first for beef, or for their meat product, and then later for milk. Milk was a secondary product. It was a very effective. And the question then became, well, what was the advantage of milk on top of the meat? If you've already got an addition to your food supply, why is it that milk suddenly is valuable? That's triggered the most debate and the most interesting research, I think. The question really is, what was the added value of drinking fresh milk? It's complicated on the one hand because you had the meat value of these animals you domesticated, so it seems unlikely that it would be just the protein or food supply, yet that was an important early argument. And the question, and it's also complicated because there are ways to get some food value from milk without drinking it fresh. You can, all societies that I know of, have ways of processing fresh milk into low lactose forms. Sour milk is a low lactose form. All the things like yogurt and kefir, drinks that are widely known in some places, and most cheeses break down the lactose externally using lactobacillus bacteria, using a separation of curds and whey. Lactose is water soluble. It drains off with the whey, and the curds are free of lactose. So most cheeses have very low lactose concentration. Something like yogurt is full of lactobacillus that's already digesting the lactose for human consumption. So here's the real challenge. In a world where most populations in a world where most populations have ways to process milk and to get everything that's in the milk, why would some populations still evolve this persistent lactase activity?
Sure.
Because they're external sources of lactase. Why does it have, what was the advantage of producing it internally to the human organism? And that's the question that I focused on early on because I thought that was just so very fascinating. On top of the food value, on top of whatever you can get from yogurt and kefir and cheese and sour milk, what's the advantage of drinking fresh milk as an adult? Especially when so many societies must have regarded it as repugnant because it would cause diarrhea, because you were intolerant. And the debate is still running, but the leading theory that I like is and that the data seem to support. In science, knowledge is always tentative, so I want to put that out there. And I will sound like I'm convinced of this, but I think we're all maintain a healthy skepticism. But the leading argument of the day is that calcium, that the advantage of drinking fresh milk, is the advantage of an additional calcium supply, especially in areas where there is a calcium deficiency caused either by inadequate calcium in the diet. Well, that's not too likely if you're drinking milk.
Sure.
But a vitamin D scarcity. Vitamin D is in turn photosynthesized in the skin in response to sunlight. So that immediately suggested to me the possibility that as you depart from low latitudes of high ultraviolet light, you would encounter chronic built-in geospatial curves of ultraviolet light deficiency, and therefore which is what's required for vitamin D synthesis, and therefore vitamin D scarcity with latitude.
Now we learn actually in lesson 6 of our course, we go and learn about mutation and variation, and we use skin pigmentation as an example.
Oh, perfect.
And so
this is parallel. So
Sure.
my hypothesis is that this was completely parallel. In fact, in Coevolution, the book that I've written on this, I have an appendix on epidermal demelanization to show the efficacy of the altitudinal gradient in ultraviolet light and vitamin D and in calcium-based selection for epidermal demelanization. So I like that as a background, and I'm just saying, look, if it's plausible there, look at the argument we can make here. And then people say, well, what's the advantage? Milk is obviously rich in calcium, but what's the advantage of having, why can't you again just eat the yogurt? And why can't you again just eat the milk product, the cheese, which is going to have the calcium in it? except for the water-soluble calcium, which you might lose some of. What's interesting was some research on what's called the lactose effect. If you feed human infants from birth in a controlled comparison, cow's milk from birth, or mother's milk, versus soy milk, you see, beginning at a matter of a few days, you see a big differential in the amount of bone-absorbed calcium. In other words, the calcification of bone is enhanced. This is controlling for the amount of calcium. You take soy milk and you supplement the calcium in it so that it matches the cow's milk. They have the same calcium, and the presence of the lactose enhances the absorption of the calcium according to these data. Now, it's a magnificent curve, and what it shows is that the ability to drink fresh milk has the advantage of making the calcium that's there an equal proportion in the two milks. It makes it more available to the infants who can absorb, who can digest the lactose. There's a mechanism suggested for this. It has to do with the transphosphorylation of one of the opening up of a calcium channel in the jejunal region, the brush border membrane cells, the jejunal region of the small intestine, and that it's the removal of a blocking phosphate that onto the splitting lactose molecule that opens up the channel, and that the presence and the breakage of the lactose molecule opens the channel for the entrance of the calcium. So that lactose is like vitamin D.
And so, and just to be clear, it's not even, maybe not per se the lactose itself, but the lactose, the action of lactose metabolism.
Correct.
It enhances the calcium uptake.
Correct.
Now, I have to ask you.
So that's like wild, because that's like saying, okay, they work differently. Vitamin D works by enhancing calcium binding protein, which actively absorbs it. But it's, in both cases, the action of the vitamin D mechanism is at the brush border cells of the jejunum of the small intestine, and so is the lactose effect, right there in the same epithelial lining. So it's pretty exciting, actually, and it suggests then that one reason that infants don't need a lot of sun exposure, at least to the best of my knowledge, is that they have the lactose effect at the same time as they have, and that those people who have the gene for persistent lactase activity continue to enjoy the lactose effect in those years all the way out for the persistent lactase activity. So what's particularly interesting about that is it's saying that lactase persistence compensates for the vitamin D deficiency that's built in to the solar radiation pattern on the surface of our Earth. So that milk, like epidermal demyelinization, they follow similar curves, and that you get the persistent lactase activity and the lactose tolerance at high latitudes.
Right, and so just to sort of reword what you say here to make sure we're clear on this, in the case for skin pigmentation, as you sort of alluded to, the idea is as human migration moved away from the equator to higher, and I guess we should also say lower latitudes.
Yes.
They had less sunlight, and so
you could say higher latitudes north and south.
Sure, higher latitudes north and south. They lost pigmentation in the skin because they needed to let more sunlight in for vitamin D.
There was selection for the entrance of more sunlight. It wasn't that they recognized a need.
Yes, exactly.
The same with milk. It wasn't
controlled.
that we were sitting around here, hoping and wishing we could have another source of calcium. What's happening is that those that happened to have this out-reproduce by, you can even test whether it's a 3%, a 2%, a 5%. How much does the difference have to be in the long run in terms of differential survival and reproduction in order for this to work out in the time frame that we have from 4,500 years BP or whatever? And I'm one of those who thinks that it's actually a pretty small advantage. Pretty small advantage, but persistent generation after generation. No fail. It's there. If you have the lactose mechanism for absorbing calcium and making strong bones, less likely to have rickets, less likely to have Harrison's sulcus, less likely to have broken bones in young adulthood, and all those things. You'll have that rigid calcification of bone, which you can see starting right out in infancy with the lactose effect.
I mean, that's amazing. Can you give us some idea maybe about the time scale that it's spread on, and also so maybe some idea of the rate of the spread, as well as the point of origin geographically?
Yeah. So what we understand today, I'm drawing mostly on the work of Sarah Tishkoff, a geneticist who's looked at the question of origins. First of all, we think there are multiple, I like to call it the big L gene. So I'm going to just use that as it's almost slang for me.
Sure.
It's not the technical name, but it makes it easy.
We
For
use-
persistent, you use?
We use L plus and minus, so we do
Okay,
plus
all right,
and minus.
L plus is persistent lactase activity.
Exactly.
All right, well, so the L plus. And what she shows is that not all L plus genes are the same.
Really?
Yep, and that there are at least 4 different origins of the big L, of the L plus gene. And they're broken out by different language families, so we're pretty clear that they had an independent origin, but the selection pressure is strong enough. So there's a Northern European one, and then it turns out that there's some on the equator in milk-dependent pastoral peoples, where the advantage of drinking milk might not have to do with calcium at all. It might have to do with water availability, fluid availability, electrolyte availability. If you live in a desert, and you've got this cow who can concentrate for you from sparse vegetation and dew into a drinkable water-based product, there's a huge advantage, especially during drought seasons and so on. So it's quite possible that those genes had a different selection pressure.
That's amazing. So, I mean, we've just learned also about the concept of an allele, and I hear you use the word gene, and just to clarify for us, we would say there are 4 different lactase persistent alleles.
Yes,
we
that's correct.
discuss one in particular that's actually is reported in personal genetics reports at places like 23andMe, but it's just very interesting that there are multiple other alleles that could cause lactase persistence.
It's not clear to me that the instruction in the gene itself is different, but the genetic environment is different enough so that they're markers to show us that it had a different origin, which is a really compelling.
Now, you said there are possibly 4 different alleles that allow for
That's
this,
correct.
and there's, you mentioned a higher latitude origin, and then even an origin in milk-dependent populations near the equator.
That's correct.
Are there 2 other origins as well, or are those?
There are 3 near the equator, and then there's the one that has evolved to high frequency in Northern Europe.
And so is the one from Northern Europe the most dominant?
The most dominant in the sense, they're all dominant
Or
genes.
prevalent, I should say, right?
They reach very parallel frequencies. They reach very high frequencies, both in these milk-dependent pastoral populations in the deserts of the equator, the Sahara Desert and surrounding environment, and then the peoples who live at high latitude in Denmark, what's today Denmark and Scandinavia and Northern Europe. So the frequencies are comparable, which is interesting, but not too surprising if we've had 4,500 years for this to evolve, and B, if you have relentless selection pressures because of the advantage of calcium or the advantage of electrolytes in water. Those are both pretty compelling pressures. I don't know, I've spent some time in a desert, and I find it very convincing. If you're out of water in the desert, life is tough. And a cow is a wonderful device for giving you water if the wells are dry, if the fields, the crops failed. Amazing to think that a cow might be a water tank. It might be a calcium device in the north and a water tank at the equator.
Even if there are negative side effects and you're not completely
Absolutely.
tolerant, I mean, it's worth it for the hydration.
But they are. You see, that's again, they've evolved the high frequency of the gene of lactase persistence. Now, it's true, not everybody, not everyone in the society, the gene is not at fixation, as we would say, it's not at 100%. But the small number of people who have diarrhea. Now, there's another, this is where I come back to the difference between intolerance and absorption. Because you can take a malabsorber, so in a population of these pastoralists living on the equator where the gene is not at fixation, some people aren't going to produce lactase. And so therefore you would expect them to be intolerant. But what's a really interesting thing, if you look in the legal documents in the last few years, someone in the US has taken a patent on a process for converting intolerant individuals to tolerance without changing their genetics. And the way it goes is that you keep giving them low dosage of milk a long enough time, they suffer diarrhea until their intestinal microflora change, and the result is they become tolerant malabsorbers. Now, their genes haven't changed. They still lack lactase. They can't produce lactase, but now they're tolerant. So guys have already taken out a patent on this, which was in fact in the folklore in a number of places, that if you could grin and bear it for a while, drinking milk, you could induce tolerance in yourself. You could make yourself, you could go from being tolerant and feeling bloated and diarrhea and all of that, you could come out the other end without those symptoms. So it's possible that in fact, and even in those societies where milk is so important as an electrolyte, source of electrolytes in water, it's possible that what they've done is introduced, most people are lactose absorbers, and that would help with for the majority of the population, and it's possible that they induce tolerance in the malabsorbers. Now, I'm speculating because I haven't
No, I mean, it even
tested
sounds
that.
reasonable, because 23andMe and other places will report, they'll give you your genotype and they will say likely tolerant or likely intolerant, because they're also aware of the gut microbiota
Absolutely.
that can essentially metabolize the lactose for you.
Exactly.
Now, I wanted you to
Or
mention...
buffer you from the diarrhea effects so that
Sure.
maybe you're not even getting, you may not be getting the full food value, but you're at least not getting the negative effects, negative symptoms.
What proportion of the world is considered to be lactose tolerant or not malabsorbers?
Personally, I go with, the figures vary. Usually people put it between 70 to 80% lactose intolerant. I would put it as 70 to 80% lactose malabsorber, because I don't really know about the symptomatics of it. How many people have the symptoms, and that it would therefore be 20 to 30% adult persistent lactase activity.
And would we assume then that in regions of the world, particularly South America, maybe East Asian, Pacific Islands, would be the areas where we have the least amount of lactase persistent individuals?
And tropical Africa, in the zone where tsetse flies discouraged cattle domestication. The geographer Fred Simoons did a wonderful study years ago showing that the tsetse belt of Africa, there are no lactose absorbers in that zone. That was one of his first clues, is that where the tsetse flies discourage cattle by the economic disadvantage of sick cattle, which isn't going to work because they all have sleeping sickness and you can't make them economically productive. There's no milk, and there has been no milk for as long as there's been tsetse flies and the trypanosome, the parasite that causes African sleeping sickness. And that is a long history, a long time ago. So what Simoons went on to argue is that this is an area, the tropical belt of Africa with the tsetse fly, it really kind of spans the equator in Tanzania and Kenya and so on. There's a belt there that with a high density of tsetse flies where it's never paid to cultivate cattle, and they're lactose malabsorbers.
Gosh.
Fascinating, isn't it? Because right nearby, outside the tsetse zone, are the milk-dependent pastoralists that have high levels. So it's a wonderful example of geography, culture, human history, and genetics all working together.
Perfect for a biological anthropologist.
Perfect for exactly. There's one more interesting case that's really fun to talk about.
Oh yeah, I want to hear it.
And that's the Inuit. The Inuit are heavily melanized dwellers of the Arctic. They moved across the Bering Strait sometime, let's say, in the last 20,000 years, and there they are with darker skin than you would expect in the Arctic, and very low rates of rickets, almost no rickets. They also aren't lactose absorbers, so what do? Way up there in the land of chronic vitamin D deficiency, very low ultraviolet, how do they make it work? It turns out that before missionaries, they had a practice of eating raw pinniped livers. Pinnipeds in turn feed on cod and small fish like that non-photosynthetically generate vitamin D. And by eating enough of the livers of the pinnipeds, they concentrate the vitamin D from this non-photosynthetic source, and so they persisted with little evidence of selection against the epidermal melanization and little evidence of selection for anything like a milk tolerance, and so on. And what's so amazing is when missionaries came in and said, oh my gosh, that's barbaric. Cutting up a seal and eating raw liver for the delicacy? That's disgusting. Stop doing that. Rickets broke out. So what's so interesting, an epidemic of rickets that was terrible, crippling for Inuit populations. What's so wonderful about this example is it shows there's multiple ways to beat the rap on calcium. Epidermal demelanization may work. The ability to drink milk in adulthood may work. And harvesting pinniped livers may work. And all of these are interesting and diverse solutions to this chronic problem built into our globe of calcium absorption, calcium deficiency.
That really is amazing. I want to ask you one more question, being sort of thinking from the anthropological side of things as well. What do you think are the biggest consequences of a growing human population with, let's say, even 20 to 30% that are able to metabolize lactose because of lactase persistence? Are there any major cultural or other changes that have happened?
One of the most interesting consequences of the discovery of adult lactose intolerance and intolerance, which came about in the 1960s in the US, was that we had to rethink our food aid. Can you imagine? We sent thousands of pounds of dried powdered skim milk to lactose malabsorbing adults all over the world. It was food aid. Now, if you stop to think about it, that's like sending a laxative. Big bags of laxative brought to you by the friendly people of the United States of America. And this came to my attention before I even heard of the phenomenon of lactose intolerance. I was touring, I did some field work in rural El Salvador. I was working in a tiny community called Tenancingo, and the mayor was taking me around town, showing me this is our granary and this is our well. He took me to the schoolhouse, and we walked in and met the children. The teacher turned them out so they could come out and sing a song for me or whatever. And I walked through the school looking at the very simple infrastructure of the school. And in the corner were all these bags of donated U.S. dried skim milk. And I said, Don Beto, why are the bags in the school? Why aren't people using? Oh, don't worry, he said, Don Guillermo. Don't worry, we do use the powder in those bags. At least twice a year we get the community together. People bring buckets. We put the bags, the powder in the bags and water together, and we whitewash the schoolhouse. And we are very grateful for the ability to whitewash the schoolhouse. And I said, but why do you use it as whitewash? He said, because the people here get sick if they eat that as the intended food product. And you just imagine, then in the ethnographic literature, there's stories of people in Bali lining up to receive small vials to put it in their family apothecary, family drug supply. If they ever need a laxative, they can take U.S. food aid. But we sent thousands of pounds a year of dried powdered skim milk to a population where 80% are lactose malabsorbers as a general human population. I think that's one of the least exposed and most obvious gaffes of assuming that what's true in our society, we have a high frequency of lactose malabsorbers because of the Northern European population that was important in the founding and the relative growth rate compared to the Native Americans of the United States. So we have a relatively high frequency of lactase persistence in adulthood. And we assumed, oh, just look at the billboards and things we had. Everybody needs milk. You never outgrow your need for milk. Well, remember that curve? You exactly do outgrow your need for milk. And most adults do. But yet we had this cultural, let us say, a cultural cocoon that said, oh, everybody needs milk. You never outgrow your need for milk. Milk does a body good. We had all of these messages, and so we started shipping milk powder, thinking it was easy to concentrate, right? You could take milk and make it dried skim milk. You could ship it quickly. It stores well. The schoolhouse in Tenancingo, I'm sure, still has some in the corner. And people found lots of different ways to use it.
Wow.
Amazing.
That is an amazing story.
It is. And so what that helps you to realize is that It's important, I think especially important for North Americans to open their eyes and realize that what our genes encourage by way of cultural activities and a cultural environment is not necessarily the same for the rest of the world.
That's exactly right. That's really all the questions I have. Is there anything else you would
It's
add?
a classic example, you know, it's such a wonderful example of the interplay of genes and of culture. We often use it for that and model genes and culture as two parallel tracks, semi-independent tracks of inheritance. And what's so great is in this particular case, you can see how, well, there's an environmental challenge coming through in let us say, in calcium, and you can see how you could change your culture and adopt the drinking of pinniped livers and solve the problem. We could see how you can evolve a high frequency of the big old gene and solve the problem, or you can live someplace where that problem is less, and the problem is actually maybe protecting yourself against sunlight and ultraviolet, and so therefore the high melanization. What I love is this idea that to understand the human organism, you can't just study the genes or the culture. You have to have them both on the table, and you have to think about both of them, how they interact, how they may compensate for one another, how they may influence one another. Because a totally successful adaptation on the part of demelanization would have, if it had been completely successful, you would be not very likely to see the evolution of lactase persistence if it had solved the problem. And what it shows you is that it helped, but that there's still a recurrent calcium deficiency at high latitude, which we know from rickets and other things. So I just love this idea that the study of the human organism involves thinking about different kinds of inheritance and their interaction in time.
Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.